would also like to offer my congratulations for the honorary doctorate you'll be receiving this evening. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce a colleague of Dr. Earls, our own resident expert on marine sedimentology, marine archaeology, and yes, tsunamis. I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Beverly Goodman Tchernov to the stage to deliver a lecture titled Saving Life with Ancient Disasters.
I begged to go first. Okay. All right, good afternoon. So, I'd like to start, before I talk about grand disasters and tsunamis, I want to start with talking about risk, and talking about risk and danger on a personal level. Okay, how do we know that we're in trouble? Okay, how do we know that we need to be afraid? How do we know that we need to watch what we're doing? Now, on an individual level, we have all kinds of mechanisms that protect ourselves from getting hurt. We have this primordial, really central fear of certain things, snakes, spiders, things that have actually helped us in our evolution over a long period of time to be able to survive and to be where we are. But of course, today, a lot of these things are a bit out of proportion. Okay, we're very afraid of, some people are very afraid. I hope I didn't trigger anyone with this photograph. Very afraid sometimes of things like spiders, when in fact there are other things that put us at higher risk, that are the things that are actually going to hurt us. So these other things we have to learn. We have to learn what is dangerous, okay? And sometimes the way that we learn that this is a dangerous thing is by accidents. Accidents happen, policies are made, changes happen, and we learn, sadly, through these accidents and through loss of life and through people getting hurt, that there's a different way to do things that is safer, and we get used to that, and that's how we do things once we learn how to do it. We might be taught by our parents, we might be told by our governments, but something is there to create some kind of mechanism to keep us from hurting ourselves or to keep our society healthy. So I'm going to talk today about disasters, talk about how to save lives, how we can save lives in the case of disasters. And I'm going to talk first about probably the most famous tsunami, the tsunami that brought the word tsunami into the household. Okay, so if I were giving this lecture 20 years ago, I would have spent probably 5 minutes at least explaining to everybody in the audience what a tsunami was, right? But today, nobody seems to be looking confused. Everyone's heard of tsunami before, and unfortunately, that's because on December 26th, 2004, I was a PhD student in Canada, and I was spending a lot of my time thinking about tsunamis and doing research on sediments that we thought were from a tsunami. And I woke up in the morning to the news that a massive earthquake had happened in the Indian Ocean, and that waves had reached the coastlines of all the surrounding countries. And eventually it would come out that nearly, or perhaps around 250,000 people died. 250,000. Obviously this was a huge shock to that region, and it sent, I hate to say the word sent waves, it sent this information all over the planet, and it was something that really alarmed and shocked the entire planet. What was especially alarming was that area knew they had earthquakes, they knew they lived by the sea, but it was general knowledge, the concept was that there isn't really a tsunami risk. The type of earthquakes weren't quite right. There was really nothing, they'd never measured a tsunami in that particular area, at least of this magnitude. And so unfortunately at that time, one of the things that was, I think, probably most shocking were images like this. Bikinis, hanging out, water went out, people wandered out. It was a really nice day. And something's coming from out in the distance. Things look a bit strange. Eventually, we have photographs of these same people running. And I'm happy to announce that some of them did survive. They've actually told the story of surviving this, but many of them died. And it made everyone say, well, how could this be? There was time. The earthquake occurred, and there would have been time if people had the education, if there had been information, if they had been told what to do, we would not have had the death toll that we had. So, of course, rescue efforts, burials, devastation, and researchers came to the region to check out what does it look like after such a large tsunami event happens. What do we expect to see? What is the fingerprint of such an event? And so what geologists do, what sedimentologists like to do, archaeologists as well, we like to dig holes, okay? So digging holes, seeing what does it look like, how thick is it, what's in it, what is it composed of, how can we measure it, how can we analyze it? And as they were digging and describing this upper layer from the tsunami event, oh, surprise, it's not the only one. As you can see just in these photographs, you see multiple layers. There was that top tsunami, but then underneath that, many places you saw soils and areas where things had been growing undisturbed for a long period of time, but beneath that, something that looked an awful lot like what they saw on the surface. Interesting. So the scientists, of course, said, wow, it looks like there were big events in the past. It's not that they thought there'd never been any tsunamis, but they certainly didn't think there had been such large ones. They said, wow, it seems that there have been tsunamis in the past. This is something that is dangerous to us. But what's interesting is there was actually a few people that weren't so surprised. In many areas in the region, you have native peoples, indigenous peoples, some of them that have very little contact even today in the Andaman Islands and in other parts of the region, have very little contact with modern society. So afterwards, helicopters went out and did flybys in these areas that are protected and mostly untouched just to see how are they doing? How are they doing? Are they all right? And believe it or not, they were all right. They were really all right. And those that did have more contact with modern society, told the stories. Turns out, some of them recognized these signs. Some of them followed things that they saw in the natural world. They watched what the animals were doing. There's a wonderful story about one of the tribes where they saw these changes in the water go out, and some of the youngsters ran into the elders and said, here's what's going on. Talk. And they said, hey, you know what? Our elders told us about the seventh wave. And we need to all go to the highlands. And they did. So in places like the Solomon Islands in 2008 and in other instances where you had very, very low death rates in these areas where they had this indigenous knowledge, because they had the stories, they had the information. So this tells us something. By knowing what happened in the past, by having that history, by having that information, we have an opportunity to be educated and to learn how to act, how to protect ourselves. In the case of those tourists and a lot of the modern construction in that region in 2004, but if we think about the entire world, in the modern world, how many places are new? How many cities didn't exist 100 years ago that are on the coastline? A lot of them, especially in areas, if you think of areas that are inhospitable, very hyper-arid regions, very dry areas, where it was simply not realistic to have a big population. But today, with air conditioners, with our fossil fuels that Sylvia was talking about, it is possible. It is possible to have a city of 1 million people in a place where you have to bring in all your food, create your water, cool off your buildings. We can do that now. They couldn't do that 100 years ago. So people are living on coastlines that used to be inhabited. Are there going to be any stories about tsunamis that occurred there? Probably not. You have to have some people to tell the stories. So the good news in the Indian Ocean, in that region, is that once they realized, wow, we can see from the record that we had tsunamis. We now know from our local indigenous peoples, they are familiar, their folklore, their oral histories tell us that there were tsunamis. So let's do something about it. So here's the tsunami seatbelt, okay? This is how you create a seatbelt in the tsunami situation. You educate, okay? All of these areas began to do drills, put signage programs, signs all along their coastlines that, first of all, educate. They say, you are in an area that has risk for tsunamis, and then you also have signs that tell you where to go. Okay, so there's the general sign that lets you know it's a problem, and then you have the signs that will actually get you out of trouble in the case that you need it. So this is sort of the good take-home message, that now this is happening all over the world in areas, I'm sure if you've traveled, even in California, in Japan, all these areas where signage programs are becoming quite common. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move a little bit from the tragic story of the 2004 event and the 250,000 people who died, and talk about, fortunately, a little local story which may be little bit more optimistic. This is a nice painting from National Geographic of Caesarea. And this is a painting based on the descriptions from Josephus Flavius of what it may have looked like when it was originally built. And you can see it was this beautiful monumental harbor. You have towers in the entrance and warehouses all over the piers. Today, if you go there, as Sylvia and I did yesterday, you will find that the majority of this harbor is underwater. It's submerged. And this drew archaeologists, historians, geologists to come there and to say, why is this submerged? What happened? Is this just deterioration? Did we have earthquakes? Was it liquefaction? What is the reason? So for decades, this was an area of research that I had the opportunity as a volunteer student coming from the US to work with Avner Rabban from the University of Haifa, and never left. And so they excavated this area, told the story from the archaeological perspective of the story of this harbor. And then in the year 2000, the first deposit that was revealed that showed a deposit that had materials that came from the deep water, from the land, from all different parts of the harbor, mixed together and dropped at one time. So how does this happen? How do you get materials coming from kilometers offshore and at deeper depths and also from land? You have to think it can't be a flood, because that would take things from land to the water. It can't be a storm, because that brings things from deeper to shallower. So we started to think perhaps we have a tsunami there. The research continued. We went from these little spot excavations to collecting cores more widely all along the coastline, thinking, okay, if this is a natural event, if this is something, we should see it all along the coastline. So we collected cores, collected more samples, went into the archaeological deposits, both what had been excavated, reading through reports, trying to see, do we have a connection on land? Are these tsunamis? And sure enough, we started to connect the dots and to see that, in fact, there is a tsunami record on the coast of Israel. Ultimately, if you connect the dots between all these deposits, today we know that there are at least 5-6 tsunamis in the past 6,000 years. So this isn't something that happened once. This is something that happens once in a while. In 2012, the Israeli government requested that a commission be put together to assess whether or not tsunamis should be included in the national emergency management plans. They researched the historical record, came together with the Geological Survey of Israel, looking at what was known from the written historical record, and they found descriptions of tsunamis. They looked at the research that I've just described to you, and they went, wow, here we have tsunamis. The elders are speaking to us. They are telling us that there are tsunamis. And fortunately, they made a decision rather quick, just a couple years, which relative for a place that hasn't had a tsunami in modern history. This is quite rare. They were able to put it into the emergency plan and begin mobilizing. So, have you been to Tel Aviv? Anyone? Okay, so if you go to Tel Aviv, if you go to Haifa, if you go to Bat Kalim, you will see signs that look like this. As you can see, they're in English and Hebrew and in Arabic, warning or educating, I should say, that tsunami, this is an area where a tsunami can occur. They also went ahead and did an international tsunami drill. First one was in 2016. The second one occurred just this year. And they did such a good job that already Israel is being approached by Greece, by Turkey, to help produce and direct emergency drills in those countries. So they're really at the forefront of activities and how to educate the people and how to prevent loss and death from these events. So here's a picture of Tel Aviv in the summertime. Beautiful, sunny day. And fortunately in Israel, or hopefully, because of these ancient disasters, the beaches of Tel Aviv with this backdrop of Jaffa will never have a photograph like this. Because we have this knowledge, and because we're using this knowledge, hopefully these ancient disasters will save many, many lives. Thank you.